Turning to 2024 presidential politics, we've got brand new NBC poll numbers out this hour. Here's what we found. By an enormous 80-point margin, Republican voters said they'd be more likely to vote for a candidate who supports sending the military to the border to stop the flow of drugs. Republicans also want candidates who support banning discussions of sex and gender in schools, oppose President Biden's climate agenda, support bans on gender-affirming care for minors, and to back a 6-week ban on abortion. Culture war issues are clearly key. But perhaps what sticks out the most is former President Trump's influence on the primary electorate. Republican voters are more likely to back candidates who say Donald Trump won the 2020 election and who support pardoning January 6 rioters. They're less likely to back candidates who don't echo Trump's hesitance to send more aid to Ukraine. They're also less likely to back candidates who clash with businesses on LGBTQ issues, who support cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Notably, those last two issues have become key Trump campaign talking points against Ron DeSantis. Joining me now on set is Mark Murray, senior political editor at NBC News, Camila DeChalus, congressional reporter for The Washington Post, former New York Democratic Congressman Joe Crowley, and Lanhee Chen, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Thanks to all of you for being here. Mark, set the table here. I mean, basically, the two key takeaways: the culture wars are king right now, and former President Trump's hold on the party is as strong as ever.
Yeah, Chris, and this is still Donald Trump's party. And also, when I actually look at what is the least popular stances, when you talk about touching entitlement programs like Medicare and Social Security, Donald Trump was just attacking Ron DeSantis about that today in New Hampshire. And then, of course, being able to say, I don't want you to penalize companies that speak their mind on LGBTQ issues, on something like on that. That is we actually tested that was the Disney situation in our poll, and that is so unpopular with Republicans. So I think that, to me, really does stand out.
Lanhee, respond to the findings in this poll, and they reinforce, I think, some of what we have known, some of what, as Mark says, we've seen play out on the campaign trail. The fact that Ron DeSantis is engaged in this war with Disney, for example. I mean, what are your takeaways when you look at these numbers?
I think your assessment of the culture issues being predominant is absolutely true. Republican primary voters want a fighter. They want someone who they perceive as being a fighter. I would also say that I think what the Trump super PAC has done pretty effectively is to run that advertising on the Florida issue and on the other issues where they perceive potential weaknesses with DeSantis. I think some of that message on Social Security and Medicare, for example, is sticking. And so they're not deploying that much, but they're deploying enough, and they're obviously hitting a target in the sense that they're getting amplification in media as well. So I think that this demonstrates, I agree, Trump still has significant influence, and those cultural issues are much more significant than the economic issues have ever been.
Camila, Democrats struggled to find their footing on the cultural issues and how to go after Republicans on that. I mean, when you look at these numbers, what do you see?
I think I see twofolds, and that being that for them to completely ignore that this is going to be something that Republicans are going to run on, but especially that it's going to be something that voters resonate with, I think that wouldn't be a wise decision. What you're going to see now is a lot of them recalibrating and seeing what is an effective messaging strategy to really convey what they would do on these issues. I mean, a lot of them are coming about talking about the freedoms, talking about children education, how it infringes upon some of the book banning that you've seen play across the country. This is what you're going to see is how not only do they mobilize Democratic voters, but also try to kind of go across the aisle and talk to voters that may vote for Trump or DeSantis on these issues.
Yeah. Joe, what do you think Democrats are going to take from these figures?
I think they can look at Republicans as being victims of their own success in many ways. They have really energized their base. They have radicalized their base on many of these issues. And I don't think it fares well for them in the general election. How do you talk to independents on these issues when your base is so strident on them, especially I think, on the Disney piece of this? I've always said, putting Walt Disney aside and all his foibles and problems that he had, Disney is an American creation. It couldn't have been created anywhere else in the world, not in China, Russia, even Europe. It happened here. It's Americana. And it also speaks to the point of keeping government out of our lives. Isn't that the Republican mantra? Yet here you are trying to keep Disney out of their lives. or getting involved in shutting down business in your own state, one of the largest employers in your state.
Yeah, and Mark, Joe brings up independence. You have some interesting figures on independent voters, too.
Yeah, and so the most popular issue, and the only one that ends up getting a majority support, and it's actually supported by independents and the overwhelming number of Republicans in this, is sending the military to stop the drugs at the border. And so, Congressman, I mean, you're exactly right. When you look, and we tested 11 different messages that are coming from the Republican campaign, the only one that had overall majority support was sending troops to the border. Everything else at the beyond that, the best is kind of jump balls with independents and the general electorate.
And you get some support on that of the White House for some of that aspect as well, in terms of troops to the border on drugs and possibly even immigration to some degree.
But it does demonstrate the degree to which the Republican Party has shifted. You know, I mean, you look at the Social Security and Medicare argument, you look at the argument on capitalism, and previously would have been a party that stood up for business and for low regulatory environment.
Ukraine also.
Ukraine's an interesting one, too. I mean, that's completely flipped in the course of maybe about a year. And so it is the enduring influence of former President Trump. I mean, that's really what it is.
And let's not forget, I mean, on immigration, Trump made that essential key point in his 2016 election. And the fact that it's come up again and it's bolstered so much support across the board, I think that also speaks volumes. And that's something you can attest to, because he was the one to talk about building a border wall and, you know, really creating galvanizing the base there.
Absolutely. And we're having this discussion against the backdrop of that new audio tape having been released of former President Trump. Camila, from a political perspective, how damaging is it? And by the way, you have Republicans on the Hill talking about potentially trying to impeach Attorney General Merrick Garland.
I mean, look, especially being on Capitol Hill and talking to Republican lawmakers to comment on Trump's use of classified documents, and a lot of them brought up Hillary Clinton saying, hey, this is the same thing. I think the biggest finding that you come just from the release of this audio is the fact that Trump said it time and time again that he did not have knowledge that he was holding these classified documents. Now you have audio where he does acknowledge that he had these classified documents in his possession. So now going back to Republicans, they're going to have to answer to that question. And I think a lot of them are kind of going around it to try to not answer that question about whether he had that. But whether that will really do a difference of making voters deter from voting from Trump, I just don't see that playing out.
Certainly not yet. His poll numbers are only going up, as our latest poll showed, Mark, right?
Yeah. And so, the entire situation on this federal indictment has been terrible news for the former president. And now we even have audio. And yes, you're exactly right. Among Republicans, they don't care about it at all. Our poll ended up having 77% of Republican primary voters saying, I have no concerns or only minor concerns about this indictment, versus 55% of general election voters. And so there is a big disconnect right now. But yes, when you look at the totality of our poll, and it shows that, Donald Trump's doing super well with Republicans, but with the general electorate, it's, he's not faring as well as a generic Republican would be right now against President Biden.
And all of this is putting Republicans in a tough spot on the campaign trail, on the Hill. This is what Speaker McCarthy told CNBC earlier today.
Trump's policies are better, straightforward than Biden's.
It makes it complicated if he's got all these trials and all this stuff overhanging.
It makes it complicated. It also helps him when.
But do you think he could win an election? Could he win an election?
Can he win that election? Yeah, he can.
You think he can?
The question is he the strongest to win the election? I don't know that answer. But can anybody beat Biden? Yeah, anybody can beat Biden. Can Biden beat other people? Yes, Biden can beat him. It's on any given day.
Lanhee, he then walked those comments back, or at least he appeared to, in an interview with Breitbart, saying he's stronger now than he was back in 2016. But what do you make overall of what we're seeing from a McCarthy? I mean, it shows just how tricky terrain this is for all Republicans.
Very tricky, very tricky. And that's why you see, you had it earlier with the Nikki Haley speech at AEI today, where the substance of her speech is Trump didn't do this and Trump didn't do that. But when asked about the elephant in the room, her answer was basically, well, I'm not a lawyer and the voters will decide. And, that's a fine posture to have. The reality is, though, at the end of the day, there is going to have to be some direct confrontation on this issue. And a couple of the candidates have done it already. But for someone to kind of be in the middle on this, I think it's just a tough place to be. It's like roadkill, right? In the middle of the road, and it's tough.
Joe, pick up on that, and just the fact that you did have Nikki Haley accusing Trump of being morally weak on China, and yet will not touch his second indictment, or even his first, really, with a 10-foot pole to criticize him in the way that, like, a Chris Christie has, for example.
I think audio tape has been around with Trump for a long time. We go back to the first campaign, what he said on that bus. And it's a similar type of scene here. It's audio tape. It's not even, you can't even visibly see it. But clearly, I think it's indictable. I think he's self-indicted here. I'm just a kid from Queens. But, I think anyone who listens to this and has this bruise over time, I think you're going to see more and more people distancing themselves. And I think even, look, I hardly ever say I agree with Kevin McCarthy, but I agree with a lot of what he said just now. It's 17 months away. A lot's going to happen, and I think even Trump is going to fall here.
Camila, what was so interesting about that comment by Speaker McCarthy is it was almost a moment where he was being candid. Now, again, in the follow-up interview, he tried to walk his comments back, but he said, I don't know if he's the strongest person in the general.
And he has to walk that fine line because he's also dealing with a group of conservative lawmakers that are watching his every move, and a lot of them do back Trump. I think some of the things that I've been listening to lawmakers, Republican lawmakers, say that almost voters on the ground in New York and across the country are kind of saying as well, Republicans, is that this is a partisan attack on Trump. That's something I've heard time and time again. Republicans really stress that if this were a Democrat or a former president, they wouldn't be doing this, but they're doing it to Trump to attack him, to prevent him from running for office. And that's something I've heard on the ground as well, talking to Republican voters.
Mark, there's a question about whether, as we get closer to the debates, as we get deeper into this campaign cycle, will you see Republicans start to pounce? Will there be a chorus of voices that rises up? You've been tracking the polls around Donald Trump for a long time. Based on what you've seen, does anything really chip away at his support?
It's been happening right now, but when we go through the poll numbers that we just did, this is still Donald Trump's party. I will also say about Kevin McCarthy, he's reading the polls exactly the same way I am. That, yes, looking at a hypothetical general election matchup, it's anyone's game. Is Donald Trump the strongest candidate? Well, our poll shows actually a generic candidate does better than Donald Trump, or Ron DeSantis does better. And then even when he walked it back to Breitbart News and said, well, Donald Trump's stronger than he was in 2016, that is actually also true. That's my reading of the polls as well. And I think 17 months from now, Kristen, look, it's anyone's, we have a long ways to go, but we have a good idea where the Republican electorate is right now.
We sure do. Fascinating conversation. Thanks to all of you for being here. Mark, Camila, Joe, and Lanhee. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.